How medieval peasants built shelters to survive. Brutal winters. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter, colder corner of the past, to the sort of world where survival wasn't about ambition or conquest, but about making it through another night without freezing solid. So, if you're tucked in, the lights are dim, and the blanket is pulled up just right. Let's go somewhere that didn't have central heating, electricity, or even a proper concept of insulation. Let's go back to medieval Europe, to the frozen fields and smoke-filled cottages of the people who built civilization from the dirt up, one shivering day at a time. Now, when most people think of the Middle Ages, they picture castles, knights, and kings. You know, the usual postcard version. Banners fluttering in the wind, torches blazing dramatically, and everyone looking very serious in uncomfortable clothing. But that's not the Middle Ages most people lived in. The real Middle Ages were mostly mud, smoke, and survival. For every glittering feast in a noble's hall, there were thousands of ordinary people huddled in huts, nursing chilblains and hoping the roof wouldn't leak before spring. And yet, somehow, they made it work, generation after generation, with nothing but wood, straw, and an impressive tolerance for discomfort. So tonight, we're not visiting the castles. We're stepping inside the peasant's house, if we can call it that, to see how it was built, how it kept them alive, and why, against all odds, it actually worked. The world outside the door before we go indoors. It helps to understand what was outside, because medieval Europe, especially in winter, was not exactly a paradise. Imagine this. It's the middle of January in, say, 13th century England or France. The fields are bare, the air smells faintly of wood smoke and manure, and the ground is so frozen that even walking across it feels like stepping on old stone. There are no cars, no roads worth mentioning, and the sun, when it bothers to appear, gives off about as much warmth as a dying candle. If you were a peasant, winter wasn't a season. It was an opponent. Food stores ran low, livestock needed shelter, and every trip outside meant frostbite was a casual possibility. So, people learned to build homes that could trap every possible bit of warmth. Not because they were architects, but because necessity is a very patient teacher. The humble beginnings of a home. Let's start with the basics. Most medieval peasants didn't have stone houses. That was a luxury reserved for the rich or the clergy. Stone was expensive, heavy, and usually owned by someone else. So, they built with what they had: earth, timber, straw, and a prayer. The two earliest homes were wattle and daub huts, a phrase that sounds oddly charming until you realize it means sticks and mud. Twattle was a woven lattice of flexible wooden branches, usually hazel or willow, tied together with strips of bark or twine. Daub was the mixture that got smeared over it to make the walls solid. A thick, fragrant paste of clay, straw, water, and, if we're being honest, animal dung. It was nature's version of concrete, sticky, messy, and surprisingly effective. The process wasn't glamorous. Whole families would help, stomping the mixture with their bare feet until it reached just the right consistency. firm enough to hold shape, but soft enough to squish satisfyingly between your toes. Once applied, it dried into a solid, surprisingly warm wall, and yes, it smelled, but only for a while. The roof, meanwhile, was thatched, made from bundles of straw or reeds layered thickly enough to repel rain and trap heat. When done well, thatch could last 20 or 30 years. When done poorly, it leaked, rotted, and occasionally hosted entire ecosystems of mice and insects. Still, in a world without insulation or heating bills, thatch was magic. It breathed, it kept the snow out, and it gave every medieval village that picturesque, slightly smoky look we now find charming. Mostly because we don't have to live in it. Fool them all now. Step inside. You'll want to duck. The doorway is low. That's partly because peasants were shorter, but mostly because smaller openings let out less heat. The typical peasant house had one room, just one, sometimes two if the family was unusually prosperous or ambitious. The floor, dirt, always dirt. Some homes scattered rushes or straw over it, both for warmth and to cover whatever unmentionable things happened to spill there. Think of it as a medieval carpet, soft, disposable, and mildly hazardous. At the center of the room was the hearth, the heart of the home. It wasn't just for cooking. It was the only source of heat. There was no chimney, not in the early days. Instead, the smoke from the fire rose through a hole in the roof, or just hung around until it found its way out. That meant the air inside was a constant haze of smoke and ash. Your clothes smelled of it, your lungs filled with it, and your eyes probably watered so often that no one ever noticed tears anymore. But it worked. The smoke helped preserve food hanging from the rafters, and even kept insects at bay. It was uncomfortable, but practical, which, in the Middle Ages, was practically a luxury. The furniture situation. Let's talk about furniture, which, in a peasant house, was less a design choice and more a coincidence. There was usually one large wooden table, a few stools or benches, and a chest or two for storage. Beds, if you could call them that, were wooden frames filled with straw or reeds, topped with wool blankets, or, more often, old cloaks and sheer willpower. Everyone slept in the same room, and often in the same bed, parents, children, sometimes grandparents, and occasionally a chicken or two. Privacy wasn't a concept. It was a future invention. At night, the fire would die down, and people would huddle together for warmth. It wasn't romantic. It was survival. And in the coldest months, even the animals might be brought inside. Cows and goats gave off heat, after all. So, yes, the medieval family home often included a few extra hooves. The smell, you ask? Let's just say it wasn't something you'd bottle and sell. Roof over their heads, the Poinkies. Roof of a peasant home was an impressive feat of low-tech engineering. Thatched roofs were made by layering bundles of straw, starting from the bottom and overlapping, upward, so that rain would slide off like scales on a fish. A well-made thatch was thick, sometimes a foot or more, and could withstand snow and rain if tended properly. Peasants often climbed onto the roof to patch holes or replace straw by hand, usually once or twice a year. It wasn't just weatherproof. It was alive. Birds nested in it, Moss grew across it, and sometimes, if you were unlucky, it caught fire. That was the downside of living in a house made of kindling. Villages burned down all the time. One stray spark, one gust of wind, and suddenly everyone was watching their year's work go up in smoke. It's why wells were so important, not just for drinking, but for the medieval equivalent of fire insurance. The walls that breathed despite the humble materials. Wattle and daub walls were surprisingly efficient. They absorbed and released moisture, keeping the air inside from getting too damp. They were thick enough to trap heat, but flexible enough to withstand storms. Over time, some peasants began to upgrade, replacing mud walls with timber frames or rough stone, plastered with lime. Whitewashed cottages became common in later centuries, giving villages that pale, soft look we now associate with quaint. The lime wash wasn't just pretty. It helped repel insects and reflected sunlight, keeping interiors slightly brighter. It also gave off that distinctive chalky smell that must have mixed beautifully with the aromas of smoke, livestock, and human effort. Winter life. Inside winter in a peasant's house was all about conserving energy, physical and thermal. Days were short, work was slow, and nights were long enough to make you question your life choices. Families rose with the sun and went to bed soon after it set. Candles were expensive, so most homes relied on the firelight alone. It flickered softly against the walls, painting the room in warm amber hues, which sounds lovely until you remember the smoke. Meals were simple. Thick stews of root vegetables, grains, and whatever salted meat or cheese was left. The pot might stay over the fire for days, constantly topped up with whatever ingredients could be spared. It was called pottage, the ancestor of the modern stew, and it was less of a recipe and more of an ongoing edible experiment. When it came to warmth, layering was key. Wool, linen, fur, anything that could trap body heat was fair game. Blankets were precious, and people often slept in their clothes. If you had a dog or a cat, it wasn't a pet. It was a small, furry heating device. And so, in this smoky, crowded, dimly lit space, medieval families survived. Not comfortably, not easily, but effectively. The sounds of survival. If you could step back in time and spend one night in a peasant cottage, the first thing you'd notice, after the smell, would be the sound. The crackle of the fire, the faint snoring of people and livestock, the rustle of straw as someone turned over in bed, the drip of water from a leaking roof, and outside, the muffled howl of the wind, sometimes broken by the distant bark of a dog or the creak of a tree. The work never stopped. Even during winter, peasants worked, just differently. They repaired tools, spun wool, wove cloth, carved wood, and mended clothing. Children helped feed animals and gather firewood, while elders told stories or offered practical wisdom, like how to keep a roof from collapsing under snow. How did medieval people really smell? The scent of a simpler time. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages. A world of stone castles, smoky hearths, and perfume that mostly came from whatever happened to be rotting nearby. So settle in, dim the lights, take a deep breath, hopefully fresher than what we're about to discuss. And let's talk about how people really smelled back when soap was optional and deodorant was just attitude. Because, contrary to what we've all been told, the Middle Ages didn't reek of filth and despair all the time. Just some of the time. But for now, take a slow breath. They sprinkled straw to absorb puddles. They burned sweet herbs to mask the smell. They even tried early versions of public cleanup ordinances. Paris, for instance, had street sweepers as early as the 13th century. We've all heard the stereotype, the one that says medieval people never bathed, that their cities were open sewers, and that everyone walked around in a kind of collective, historical stench. It's not entirely wrong, but as usual, the truth is far more complicated. For one thing, medieval noses were different from ours. Not physically, of course, but culturally. They were trained to notice different smells and to interpret them differently. Where we might smell dirty laundry or wet dog, they smelled the natural order of things, and they had entire systems of belief about what smells meant, spiritually, morally, even medically. A pleasant smell was a sign of purity. A foul smell meant sin, which was awkward, since almost everything in a medieval town smelled faintly of sin. Let's start in a place that really did smell, the medieval city. Imagine London around the year 1300, about 80,000 people. No sewers, lots of animals. Every street had butchers, tanners, brewers, and candle makers. All very busy, all very smelly. And because waste disposal wasn't exactly a science, the results of those industries often went straight into the gutters. But here's the surprising thing. People noticed. They complained. A lot, the city authorities in London, Paris, and Florence all issued laws trying to stop people from dumping filth into the streets. It didn't always work. Enforcement was a bit of a lost art, but it shows they weren't oblivious. They didn't live in filth because they liked it. They just hadn't quite figured out how to make plumbing happen yet. Now, when we think of hygiene, we tend to imagine showers and soap. They thought of baths and balance. The human body, they believed, was governed by the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of anyone, and you'd fall ill. Bathing wasn't just for cleanliness. It was for medical harmony. Warm water opened the pores, releasing vapors. Cold water closed them. So a perfect bath required careful timing. Ideally, mid-morning, after digestion, but before the day's exertions began. Yes, medieval people had bath schedules, because of course they did. Public bathhouses existed in almost every medieval town. They weren't just tolerated, they were popular. In places like Paris and Nuremberg, bathhouses were as common as taverns. People went there to bathe, gossip, eat, drink wine, and occasionally do things that didn't involve soap at all. So yes, by the 15th century, some bathhouses had reputations less health spa and more social experiment. But the point stands, people cared about being clean, or at least cleaner than usual. Even poorer folks washed when they could. A basin, a jug of water, and a rag were the standard tools of morning hygiene. You didn't need a full tub to wash your face, hands, and feet. And medieval manuals on etiquette remind readers to do just that, especially before meals. Because nothing says civilized like not smelling of last night's stew. Speaking of stew, the medieval diet was another key ingredient in the aroma of the age. Lots of meat, lots of onions, very few vegetables unless you were poor, and therefore healthier than the rich by accident. Spices were used heavily, not just for flavor, but for preservation and, frankly, camouflage. If your meat smelled a little questionable, just add cinnamon. It was the medieval version of best before. Wealthier nobles, of course, could afford more exotic ingredients. Saffron, pepper, cloves, which meant that rich people smelled faintly of imported spices, while peasants smelled of cabbage and sheep. Dürtke, olfactory class divide was real. Let's drift into the wardrobe for a moment. Clothes in the Middle Ages weren't washed often, mostly because washing wool or linen by hand took an eternity and ruined the fabric. So instead of laundering, people relied on layering and airing. The idea was simple. You wore a linen shirt next to your skin to absorb sweat and oils, then heavier garments on top to protect the linen. The shirt could be washed occasionally, the outer layers less so, and yes, people owned soap, but it wasn't the floral kind. Medieval soap was made from animal fat and lye, often smelling faintly of exactly what it was made from. So while it cleaned, it didn't exactly leave you smelling like a meadow. To mask this, people used herbal sachets, little pouches filled with dried lavender, rosemary, or mint, tucked into sleeves or sewn into collars. It was perfume by proximity. Some nobles even had their clothes stored in chests filled with herbs, so that when they dressed, they'd carry a faint scent of time and dignity. Now, the question of body odor, the one everyone really wants answered. Yes, people smelled, but it wasn't the same kind of smell we'd notice today. Without chemical perfumes, deodorant, or processed food, human scent was earthier, more natural, less industrial, and because everyone smelled similar, no one really noticed. But there were exceptions. Certain individuals were notorious for their scent, and not in a good way. Chroniclers, who were often monks and therefore easily offended by mortal flesh, loved to describe rulers as either sweet-smelling and holy or reeking of sin. A convenient metaphor, but sometimes accurate. Richard III, for instance, was said to have suffered from a constant unpleasant odor, possibly from a skin condition. Meanwhile, Saint Elizabeth of Hungary was described as miraculously fragrant, her corpse emitting a smell sweeter than roses. In medieval logic, holiness smelled like a florist. We can't talk about medieval cleanliness without mentioning the church, which, as usual, complicated everything. Monks and nuns were technically supposed to avoid vanity, including frequent bathing. Yet many monasteries had some of the best plumbing in Europe. Running water, latrines, even heated baths. Because, of course, vows of poverty never quite applied to personal comfort. Bathing in moderation was seen as good, but bathing for pleasure was a moral gray area. Cleanliness was next to godliness, but if you enjoyed it too much, that was suspicious. In one 14th century sermon, a preacher warned that the devil lurks in the steam of hot baths, which seems a bit unfair to steam, but does explain why so many moralists preferred cold water. Let's drift for a moment to the countryside. Imagine a peasant cottage, smoky, crowded, with a dirt floor and a single window. It's easy to assume it reeked of sweat and livestock, but fresh air, open fields, and the absence of industrial pollution meant rural smells were probably cleaner than we imagine. Wood smoke, hay, animals, earth after rain, and yes, manure. But that was just part of the ecosystem. Peasants didn't worry much about their scent unless they were heading to church or a festival. Then they'd wash, brush their hair with wooden combs, and maybe rub a sprig of rosemary behind their ears. A medieval version of going out fresh. Perfume itself was a luxury and a powerful social signal. The earliest European perfumes were basically herbal tinctures in alcohol or oil, imported from the Islamic world, where perfumery was a refined art. Crusaders brought back rosewater and musk, and soon everyone with money wanted to smell vaguely expensive. Royal courts reeked, but intentionally. The higher your status, the stronger your perfume. One chronicler described the court of France as, "Oh, cloud of amber and civet," which sounds pleasant until you realize civet came from the glands of a cat-like animal. The Queen of Hungary even made her own perfume, Hungary water, a mixture of rosemary, lavender, and alcohol. It became one of Europe's first commercial fragrances and remained popular for centuries. So if you were rich enough, you could smell like a botanical garden. If not, you just hoped the wind was kind. Let's take a quiet detour into medicine, because medieval doctors were very concerned about smell. They believed disease spread through miasma, or bad air, rotting corpses, stagnant water, spoiled food, all dangerous because of the odors they released. To protect yourself, you didn't need disinfectant. You needed perfume. During the Black Death, people carried pomanders, small metal balls, filled with herbs and vinegar-soaked sponges. To purify the air around them, doctors wore those long-beaked plague masks filled with aromatic substances. And while it didn't work, at least they died smelling pleasant. So, how did the Middle Ages really smell? Probably like humanity. Sweat and soap, smoke and roses, rot and rain. Not good, not bad, just alive. To modern noses, it might be overwhelming, but to them, it was the scent of the world in balance. The divine, the dirty, and everything in between. Let's drift onward, then, to the perfumed courts of Europe, where royalty turned scent into politics, and smelling too nice could get you accused of witchcraft. How did peasants take a day off? The illusion of rest, hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter time. Not a simpler one, just quieter. Mostly because everyone was too tired to talk. We're going back to the Middle Ages to see what it meant for an ordinary person to take a day off, because we often imagine medieval peasants as endlessly toiling in the fields, barefoot and sunburnt, while lords looked on from balconies made of solid hierarchy. But even peasants, allegedly, had days of rest. The problem is that their day off didn't look much like ours. No hammocks, no long brunches, no weekend trip to somewhere with Wi-Fi. It was more like a day where you were slightly less likely to die from exhaustion. So, make yourself comfortable. Dim the lights, and let's drift back to a world where rest was relative, and free time was a kind of miracle, usually sponsored by the church, and often ruined by livestock. We should begin with the obvious. Medieval peasants did have more holidays than you might think. In much of Christian Europe, between saints' days, feast days, and the occasional royal coronation, a peasant could theoretically have up to 80 or 90 days off per year. That sounds generous, almost French. But of course, the word holiday comes from holy day, and holy days were rarely restful. They began with church services, continued with processions, and ended with mandatory feasting that required someone to cook, someone to clean, and someone to chase the chickens that had escaped halfway through. It was rest the same way Christmas dinner is rest. technically a break, but emotionally, not so much. A peasant's year was governed by what historians call the agricultural calendar, which is just a polite term for permanent exhaustion, seasonally themed. Spring meant planting, summer meant weeding, autumn meant harvesting, and winter was the brief window in which your hands stopped bleeding long, enough to repair the thatch roof before it fell in. The concept of a weekend didn't exist. The church gave you Sunday, but you were still expected to milk the cow on your way to Mass. The cow did not recognize the Sabbath, and so a medieval peasant's day off usually meant fewer field chores, but more religion. Let's picture one of those days. It's Sunday morning in, say, 13th century England. The village is still damp with fog. Someone's rooster is taking its job too seriously. You wake up on a straw mattress that crunches when you turn, partly because it's straw, partly because it contains small, motivated wildlife. Your first task is to get the fire going, not because you're cooking breakfast, but because everyone would like to not die of hypothermia. Then it's time to head to church. Mass lasts an hour, maybe two, depending on how inspired Father Jeffrey feels. You stand, kneel, stand again, mumble Latin you don't understand, and hope your children don't set anything on fire. Afterward comes the social part. Gossip, ale, and small arguments about whose pig ate whose turnips this time. Technically, this is the restful bit, though it often ends in fines. If you were lucky enough to live near a market town, Sunday could also mean trade. Even though commerce was discouraged on holy days, it still happened. People needed salt, shoes, and occasionally a new hoe. The farming kind, not the scandalous kind, though medieval gossip could blur the line. So peasants walked miles with carts, bartered and lugged everything home again by sunset. They were exhausted, but in a festive way, which was, apparently, the goal. Now, one of the strangest things about peasant life is that rest and punishment were sometimes the same event. For instance, if a peasant misbehaved, say, by stealing grain or gossiping about the reeve's unfortunate haircut, they might be sentenced to spend time in the stocks. And while that was humiliating, it did technically count as a break from plowing. You could even chat with friends who passed by. Granted, they were mostly throwing vegetables at you, but still, social interaction, most real rest came in winter. Once the harvest was done and the ground frozen, there wasn't much to do but mend tools, repair fences, and stare into the fire, wondering if spring would ever return. That was when peasants could actually sleep in, sometimes as late as sunrise, which for them was pure decadence, and yet, even then, there was pressure to stay productive, because idleness was considered sinful. If you weren't actively laboring, You were probably planning something immoral, like thinking. The church promoted the idea that honest work kept the devil away. So, when peasants weren't working, they were supposed to be praying, singing psalms, or at least pretending to, basically spiritual busy work. Let's drift for a moment to the idea of two sleeps, because this is one of those lovely historical details that makes the past feel slightly alien. Before artificial light, people often slept in two segments. They'd go to bed after dark, sleep for 4 or 5 hours, wake up around midnight, and stay up for an hour or two before drifting back to sleep until dawn. The in-between period was called the watch. During the watch, peasants might pray, talk, visit neighbors, or, according to several concerned churchmen, engage in marital recreation. It was, in a way, their private leisure time. The only hours of peace in a day otherwise owned by daylight and labor. So when we ask how peasants took a day off, part of the answer is, in small installments, between sleeps. Another kind of rest came from feasting, and medieval Europe adored a feast. The church calendar was full of them. Easter, Pentecost, Michaelmas, and roughly 1,000 saints' days, many of which no one could pronounce. On feast days, the work stopped, theoretically. Peasants gathered for food, ale, and entertainment, which often included mumming plays. Amateur theatrics performed by people who had no business performing. There might be singing, dancing, and the occasional wrestling match, which, in true medieval fashion, counted as both sport and theological metaphor. Feast days were also when peasants drank the year's ale, which had to be consumed before it spoiled. That rule was obeyed with touching devotion. And while everyone was supposed to maintain piety, a few records hint that things sometimes got out of hand, which is historian code for the sheriff had to intervene. Peasants also found creative excuses for half-days off. Rain, for instance. Heavy rain meant the fields were unusable, and so peasants could stay indoors, repair tools, and quietly thank the weather for its mercy. They didn't call it self-care, but that's essentially what it was. Sundown, too, was sacred, not in a spiritual sense, but because you physically couldn't see what you were doing anymore. Work stopped when light stopped, so evenings belonged to the family. Small talk by the fire, mending clothes, or telling stories that had survived generations of mild embellishment. That was leisure. The medieval way. It's worth noting that peasant doesn't mean poor beggar. Some were moderately well off, owning a few acres and a cow or two. Their rest days might include supervising hired laborers, a form of leisure modern managers might recognize. Others were serfs, legally bound to the land, with rest, determined by the Lord's schedule and whims. If he decided the hay needed turning on a holy day, God could wait. There were even cases where peasants petitioned the manor court for extra holidays, often on the grounds of local tradition. My grandfather rested on St. Swithin's Day, they'd argue, and so should I. Sometimes it worked, which is proof that even in the 1300s, collective bargaining occasionally succeeded. Of course, the Black Death in the 14th century changed everything. With so many people gone, surviving peasants suddenly had bargaining power. They demanded higher wages and shorter hours, and occasionally they got them. For a while, at least, labor shortages gave workers more leverage than theology ever had. You can almost imagine some exhausted plowman saying, "Actually, I think I'll take tomorrow off," and no one daring to argue. A small, grim silver lining. So far, we've seen that the medieval day off wasn't really a day, nor particularly off. It was more like a pause, a flicker of quiet between obligations. And yet, within those pauses, there was real rest, laughter, ale, community, the kind of simple joy that can only exist when options are limited. Because the truth is, peasants didn't need much to feel content. A warm hearth, a working roof, and a reason not to be outside in the mud. That was luxury. And while all of this might sound unpleasant, it's worth remembering. The people of the Middle Ages didn't think of it as filthy. They were surrounded by the same smells from birth. They were used to it, the way modern cities are used to traffic noise. To them, this was life, earthy, imperfect, and profoundly communal. When nature called, it didn't matter if you were a peasant or a prince. You found your spot, you did your business, and you hoped the wind was blowing in a favorable direction. But back to less gilded realities. Cities reeked. Water was risky. Epidemics came and went. And yet, people adapted. Let's drift now toward something slightly different. The rituals of rest. The small gestures that marked time off, even if they lasted only an hour. A change of clothes, a cleaner tunic, a few drops of scented oil if you could afford it, or, more commonly, absolutely nothing except permission to sit down. These were the moments that gave rhythm to a life of repetition, and though they left few traces in written history, because historians, sadly, prefer wars to naps, they mattered. How did peasants take a day off? The illusion of rest, hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter time. Not a simpler one, just quieter. Mostly because everyone was too tired to talk. We're going back to the Middle Ages to see what it meant for an ordinary person to take a day off. Because we often imagine medieval peasants as endlessly toiling in the fields, barefoot and sunburnt, while lords looked on from balconies made of solid hierarchy. But even peasants, allegedly, had days of rest. The problem is that their day off didn't look much like ours. No hammocks, no long brunches, no weekend trip to somewhere with Wi-Fi. It was more like a day where you were slightly less likely to die from exhaustion. So, make yourself comfortable. Dim the lights, and let's drift back to a world where rest was relative, and free time was a kind of miracle, usually sponsored by the church, and often ruined by livestock. We should begin with the obvious. Medieval peasants did have more holidays than you might think. In much of Christian Europe, between saints' days, feast days, and the occasional royal coronation, a peasant could theoretically have up to 80 or 90 days off per year. That sounds generous, almost French. But of course, the word holiday comes from holy day, and holy days were rarely restful. They began with church services, continued with processions, and ended with mandatory feasting that required someone to cook, someone to clean, and someone to chase the chickens that had escaped halfway through. It was rest the same way Christmas dinner is rest. Technically a break, but emotionally not so much. A peasant's year was governed by what historians call the agricultural calendar, which is just a polite term for permanent exhaustion, seasonally themed. Spring meant planting, summer meant weeding, autumn meant harvesting, and winter was the brief window in which your hands stopped bleeding long, enough to repair the thatch roof before it fell in. The concept of a weekend didn't exist. The church gave you Sunday, but you were still expected to milk the cow on your way to Mass. The cow did not recognize the Sabbath, and so a medieval peasant's day off usually meant fewer field chores, but more religion. Let's picture one of those days. It's Sunday morning in, say, 13th century England. The village is still damp with fog. Someone's rooster is taking its job too seriously. You wake up on a straw mattress that crunches when you turn, partly because it's straw, partly because it contains small, motivated wildlife. Your first task is to get the fire going, not because you're cooking breakfast, but because everyone would like to not die of hypothermia. Then it's time to head to church. Mass lasts an hour, maybe two, depending on how inspired Father Jeffrey feels. You stand, kneel, stand again, mumble Latin you don't understand, and hope your children don't set anything on fire. Afterward comes the social part. Gossip, ale, and small arguments about whose pig ate whose turnips this time. Technically, this is the restful bit, though it often ends in fines. If you were lucky enough to live near a market town, Sunday could also mean trade. Even though commerce was discouraged on holy days, it still happened, People needed salt, shoes, and occasionally a new hoe. The farming kind, not the scandalous kind, though medieval gossip could blur the line. So peasants walked miles with carts, bartered and lugged everything home again by sunset. They were exhausted, but in a festive way, which was, apparently, the goal. Now, one of the strangest things about peasant life is that rest and punishment were sometimes the same event. For instance, if a peasant misbehaved, say, by stealing grain or gossiping about the reeve's unfortunate haircut, they might be sentenced to spend time in the stocks. And while that was humiliating, it did technically count as a break from plowing. You could even chat with friends who passed by. Granted, they were mostly throwing vegetables at you, but still, social interaction, most real rest came in winter. Once the harvest was done and the ground frozen, there wasn't much to do but mend tools, repair fences, and stare into the fire, wondering if spring would ever return. That was when peasants could actually sleep in, sometimes as late as sunrise, which for them was pure decadence, and yet, even then, there was pressure to stay productive, because idleness was considered sinful. If you weren't actively laboring, you were probably planning something immoral, like thinking. The church promoted the idea that honest work kept the devil away. So, when peasants weren't working, they were supposed to be praying, singing psalms, or at least pretending to, basically, spiritual busy work. Let's drift for a moment to the idea of two sleeps, because this is one of those lovely historical details that makes the past feel slightly alien. Before artificial light, people often slept in two segments. They'd go to bed after dark, sleep for 4 or 5 hours, wake up around midnight, and stay up for an hour or two before drifting back to sleep until dawn. The in-between period was called the watch. During the watch, peasants might pray, talk, visit neighbors, or, according to several concerned churchmen, engage in marital recreation. It was, in a way, their private leisure time, the only hours of peace in a day otherwise owned by daylight and labor. So when we ask how peasants took a day off, part of the answer is, in small installments, between sleeps. Another kind of rest came from feasting, and medieval Europe adored a feast. The church calendar was full of them. Easter, Pentecost, Michaelmas, and roughly 1,000 saints' days, many of which no one could pronounce. On feast days, the work stopped, theoretically. Peasants gathered for food, ale, and entertainment, which often included mumming plays. Amateur theatrics performed by people who had no business performing. There might be singing, dancing, and the occasional wrestling match, which, in true medieval fashion, counted as both sport and theological metaphor. Feast days were also when peasants drank the year's ale, which had to be consumed before it spoiled. That rule was obeyed with touching devotion. And while everyone was supposed to maintain piety, a few records hint that things sometimes got out of hand, which is historian code for the sheriff had to intervene. Peasants also found creative excuses for half-days off. Rain. For instance, heavy rain meant the fields were unusable, and so peasants could stay indoors, repair tools, and quietly thank the weather for its mercy. They didn't call it self-care, but that's essentially what it was. Sundown, too, was sacred, not in a spiritual sense, but because you physically couldn't see what you were doing anymore. Work stopped when light stopped, so evenings belonged to the family. Small talk by the fire, mending clothes, or telling stories that had survived generations of mild embellishment. That was leisure. The medieval way. It's worth noting that peasant doesn't mean poor beggar. Some were moderately well off, owning a few acres and a cow or two. Their rest days might include supervising hired laborers, a form of leisure modern managers might recognize. Others were serfs, legally bound to the land, with rest determined by the Lord's schedule and whims. If he decided the hay needed turning on a holy day, God could wait. There were even cases where peasants petitioned the manor court for extra holidays, often on the grounds of local tradition. My grandfather rested on St. Swithin's Day, they'd argue, and so should I. Sometimes it worked, which is proof that even in the 1300s, collective bargaining occasionally succeeded. Of course, the Black Death in the 14th century changed everything. With so many people gone, surviving peasants suddenly had bargaining power. They demanded higher wages and shorter hours, and occasionally they got them. For a while, at least, labor shortages gave workers more leverage than theology ever had. You can almost imagine some exhausted plowman saying, "Actually, I think I'll take tomorrow off," and no one daring to argue. A small, grim silver lining. So far, we've seen that the medieval day off wasn't really a day, nor particularly off. It was more like a pause, a flicker of quiet between obligations. And yet, within those pauses, there was real rest, laughter, ale, community, the kind of simple joy that can only exist when options are limited. Because the truth is, peasants didn't need much to feel content. A warm hearth, a working roof, and a reason not to be outside in the mud. That was luxury. And while all of this might sound unpleasant, it's worth remembering. The people of the Middle Ages didn't think of it as filthy. They were surrounded by the same smells from birth. They were used to it, the way modern cities are used to traffic noise. To them, this was life, earthy, imperfect, and profoundly communal. When nature called, it didn't matter if you were a peasant or a prince. You found your spot, you did your business, and you hoped the wind was blowing in a favorable direction. But back to less gilded realities. Cities reeked. Water was risky. Epidemics came and went. And yet, people adapted. Let's drift now toward something slightly different. The rituals of rest. The small gestures that marked time off, even if they lasted only an hour. A change of clothes. A cleaner tunic. A few drops of scented oil if you could afford it. Or, more commonly, absolutely nothing except permission to sit down. These were the moments that gave rhythm to a life of repetition. And though they left few traces in written history, because historians, sadly, prefer wars to naps, they mattered. What happened to the wives of fallen knights? Of a simpler time. The widow's waiting game. Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages. A world to a time of castles, crusades, hearths, and a great deal of waiting. Specifically, happened to be waiting for husbands who had ridden off in shining armor, and who, quite often, didn't come back. So, settle in what we're about to dim the lights, and let's maybe have a sip of something really smelled. And let's talk about what happened to the women left behind. Just attitude. The wives of fallen knights. Contrary to what we've all been told, for every heroic death sung in battle, filth there was someone sitting by a window somewhere, just staring into the rain, and wondering whether her husband was dead. Take a slow breath. Just very bad at writing letters. They sprinkled straw to when we picture medieval widows, we often imagine noble ladies in black veils, tragically beautiful, early perhaps reading a psalter by candlelight. In reality, Paris, most of them were too busy trying not to starve as early as their 13th century, or get married off to someone who smelled like a damp horse blanket. The one that says, medieval people. Let's start with a little context. That their cities knights were the middle management of medieval warfare. Everyone walked around not quite royalty, but definitely not the peasant stench. They were the minor aristocrats who did the fighting, but managed estates and spent half their lives trying to avoid debt and gout. And when one of them fell in battle, or disappeared on crusade, but the immediate result wasn't romantic. To notice different smells, it was paperwork, and to interpret them differently. Because medieval society wasn't kind to unattached women, or especially those with property. They smelled the natural order of everything, things, and a widow's land was like a stake of belief tossed into a den of hungry lawyers. Spiritually, if her husband died without an heir, the land usually reverted to the Lord he served. If she did have a son, the estate went into wardship, which was some other man, conveniently chosen by the king, got to manage everything on her behalf. In theory, this was meant to protect her. In practice, it was more like a polite robbery with a wax seal around the year. Widows, though, had one major bargaining chip: no sewers, to remain unmarried. Every street had butchers, ever fond of control, brewers, granted noble widows the right to choose whether to remarry. It sounds empowering. But in reality, it just meant men had to work a little harder to pressure them. The results of those industries often went widows were simply remarried off. But here's the strategic reasons. A powerful lord might suggest that she marry one of his men to keep her lands within authorities in London. If she refused, and she risked losing everything anyway, so a lot of them did what medieval people were best at: strategic compromise. Some married quickly to secure their position, but others entered convents to avoid being married at all. Didn't live in trading property for peace and a nice quiet cell with better heating than most castles. How to make plumbing happen. Of course, there were the unluckiest ones. When we think of hygiene, we tend to imagine widows, showers, and soap. When a knight disappeared, lost on crusade, missing after battle, or simply dead somewhere inconveniently far away, his wife entered a bizarre yellow bile, and was she a widow? Or just married to someone very overdue? Medieval law wasn't prepared for that. It was for without proof of death. She couldn't remarry. Without a husband, she couldn't run her estate freely. It was like being ghosted for eternity. But with actual ghosts involved, required careful some of these women waited years, ideally even decades, for word. After letters might take months to travel. But before the day's exertions began, a knight captured in the Holy Land could languish in ransom negotiations because of course they did. Meanwhile, his wife was expected to remain faithful, run the estate, and not make too much noise about it. They were popular. A few didn't wait places like Paris. In 13th century England, we find records of women petitioning the king for permission to remarry after 10 years of silence, essentially saying, I think he's definitely dead now. Things that didn't involve soap at all. The crown would usually send an official to check. They'd ask returning crusaders if they'd seen Sir Whoever, and more if no one had. Experiment. Well, but congratulations, you're a widow now. It was bureaucracy by hearsay, or at least now, than usual. Some widows thrive. Even poorer folks watched when they over to the story of Eleanor de Montfort, a woman who could teach a master class in widowly resilience. Tools of mourning Eleanor was married to William Marshall the Younger. Full tub to wash your face. That Marshall family, and the one that practically ran England in the early 13th century. Remind readers when William died young, Eleanor did what most widows were expected to do: retire gracefully. Because nothing perhaps into a nunnery. Instead, not smelling of last night's stew with Simon de Montfort. Of stew, the man who would go on to lead a full-scale rebellion against the aroma of the age. It wasn't subtle. Lots her brother, Henry III, was furious. Her new husband became the leader of England's first parliament, and therefore healthier. And Eleanor, the dowdy widow, found herself at the center of political history, not just for flavor. Her story ended badly, and frankly, Simon was killed, his body mutilated, and Eleanor fled into exile. But it shows that widowhood wasn't always the end of the story. Best before. For some, it was the only time they truly lived freely, could afford more exotic ingredients. Come back down to earth. Saffron. Most widows weren't Eleanor's, which meant most were more like Isabella of Gloucester, who had the dubious honor of being King John's first wife. And sheep. John married her for her lands. Naturally, he was famously more in love with property than people. When he divorced her, he kept the lands and conveniently declared that she couldn't remarry without his permission. Washing wool or linen. She spent nearly 15 years in that strange, half-married, half-imprisoned status, laundering, until John finally allowed her to wed again. The idea was by simple. Then, She was in her 40s. Wore a linen shirt. Her best years spent as royal to absorb sweat. It's a sad little pattern. And heavier garments when a woman's husband died or vanished. She often became less of a person and more of a line item. The an estate to be so transferred, and yes, a name on people owned so, unless. But she was clever. The floral unless kind. She played the system. Medieval some widows mastered the art of survival and lie. They turned legal ambiguity into a kind of shield. What it was made from. Take so Alice de Lacy, one of the wealthiest heiresses in England, like a meadow. After her husband was executed for treason in 1322, little pouches Alice found herself single, lavender, childless, and swimming in enemies tucked into sleeves. But she used her widowhood to her advantage. It was perfume. She refused to remarry, managed her estates personally, and negotiated directly with the king. So that when she even managed to outlive most of the men who tried to control her. By the time she died, the question she was so rich and so stubborn that chroniclers described her as formidable. Yes, which people for a medieval woman, but it was code for terrifyingly competent today. Let's pause for a moment. Perfumes. Imagine a medieval manor house. Processed food. Its lord long gone. Was earthier, its lady sitting by the hearth. Less the servants still defer to her. And because everyone's letters arrive with red wax seals, some offering condolences, others demanding rent. Individuals her husband's armor gathers dust in the corner, and not a silent reminder of the life she's now managing alone. Who were often wasn't romantic, and therefore it was practical, offended by mortal flesh. We often think of medieval widowhood as something tragic, sweet-smelling, but for many women, holy, it was the only stage of life where they had legal independence. As a daughter, she belonged to her father. As a wife, Richard III, to her husband, was said to have suffered from a constant, belonged to herself. Possibly she could sign skin condition. She could inherit property. Saint Elizabeth of Hungary was described as miraculously fragrant. Some even wielded military power, sweeter than roses. When northern England was raided by the Scots, widows of dead knights sometimes took command of their estate's defenses. We can't talk about medieval cleanliness. There are records of women hiring guards, maintaining watchtowers, and even managing small garrisons. Monks and nuns it wasn't commonly supposed to avoid vanity, of course, including others weren't so lucky. If a widow had no family, no sons, and no leverage, her life could become a quiet, latrine, grinding struggle for survival. Some ended up living under the vows of poverty, protection of monasteries, to personal comfort, which often meant unpaid servitude. Others, bathing, were forced into remarriage with men decades good, older or far poorer. For pleasure, the medieval world didn't like unattached. Women, cleanliness, they were unpredictable. Godliness and independence, but if you in that era too much, was almost a scandal. Suspicious. So many widows had to perform grief as a kind of armor. The devil they dressed in black, steam attended mass daily, and cultivated reputations for chastity. But does explain why so many moralists behind the scenes cold water. They quietly managed their land. Let's drift for a moment, arranged their children's futures, and tried not to draw too much attention. Smoky. Let's drift back to the with a image we started with, and a wife at the window. It's easy a husband gone to war of sweat and the livestock. Beyond the castle walls still turning, open fields, the seasons changing, and the absence of industrial pollution, the letters not arriving, smells were probably sometimes he returned. We imagine. Sometimes a stranger brought home his sword instead. Sometimes no one ever did. Earth after rain. But life went on, and yes, widows remarried. But that was just part of the ecosystem. Estates peasants didn't worry much about their across scent, Europe, generation after generation, or if these women quietly kept their worlds running, they'd walk while history looked the other way with wooden combs, and in between all this, maybe rub a sprig of long gaps of waiting behind their ears, the small side jobs, a medieval the quiet isolation, going out. There were the rituals. Executioners took their work seriously. They maintained their tools meticulously, and they practiced sword strikes on straw bundles. They memorized prayers. European some even fasted before an execution, believing it was a sacred act. Imported from the Islamic world, this wasn't cruelty. Perfumery was it was refined art, because someone had to do it. Someone had to swing the sword cleanly, so that the condemned didn't suffer. Someone had to know how to tie a noose correctly. Someone had to make sure the gallows didn't collapse mid-spectacle. And that your status was usually a man no one else wanted to talk to. Chronicler described the court of France as when there were no executions, amber and when the air was quiet, which sounds and the scaffold unused, until you realized the executioner lived in a strange twilight of a cat, not quite a villain. Not quite a public servant of Hungary, just a man with a job too grim to discuss, and too necessary to ignore. A mixture of rosemary, London employed scavengers and alcohol to collect waste. It became one of many towns. First commercial fines were imposed for dumping refuse near wells for centuries. Though enforcement if you was rich enough, flexible, you could smell like it was an imperfect system. But it was a start. You just hoped let's drift onward then to what became of those who didn't stay behind into medicine. The ones who followed their husbands to war were very concerned and about sometimes outlived them. How did people in the Middle Ages actually go to the bathroom? The quiet horror behind the castle walls. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before plumbing, before porcelain, before anyone thought to ask, where does all of this go? So, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, because we're about to take a slow, meandering journey into one of the most overlooked parts of medieval history. How people, from peasants to kings, went to the bathroom. It's not a glamorous topic. No one writes poetry about it. But it's one of those quiet realities that shaped how medieval cities smelled, how castles were built, and how everyone, no matter how noble, had to face the same simple truth. What goes in must eventually come out. Now, the first thing to understand about medieval hygiene is that it wasn't non-existent. It was just enthusiastic in different directions. People cared deeply about being clean. They washed their faces. They changed their linen. They sprinkled rose water on things. But, unfortunately, no one quite knew what to do about waste. There were no underground pipes humming quietly beneath cobbled streets, no tiled bathrooms or flushing toilets. The concept of indoor plumbing was, at best, a vague dream occasionally sketched by engineers who were probably dismissed as eccentric. So, the medieval world relied on what can generously be described as creative solutions. Let's start with the castles. Because if anyone in the Middle Ages had access to decent facilities, it would be the nobility, right? Well, not quite. Castle toilets were known as garderobes. And they were exactly as romantic as they sound. A garderobe was essentially a stone bench with a hole in it. That hole led to a vertical shaft, which ran straight down the castle wall, often over the moat or into a cesspit. That was it. No seat, no door latch, no privacy, and certainly no flushing mechanism, just gravity and faith. Some garderobes were strategically placed so that the waste dropped into running water. Others just didn't bother, which meant that the castle walls could slowly develop what archaeologists politely call organic staining. And yes, in many places, it froze solid in the winter. Now, you might wonder, what about the smell? Well, castles already smelled. Between the damp stone, the rush-covered floors, the cooking fires, and the livestock occasionally wandering through the courtyard, one more unpleasant odor didn't make much difference. But for those who cared, there were small comforts. Some garderobes were perfumed with herbs. Mint, rosemary, or lavender might be scattered nearby to disguise the aroma. A sort of medieval air freshener, if you will, though I doubt it fooled anyone for long. And then there was the name itself. Garderobe. It literally means clothes room, which sounds odd until you remember that hanging your clothes near a toilet was thought to keep away fleas. Apparently, the smell drove them off. So, yes, the word wardrobe originally meant that place by the toilet. History, always glamorous. But even the best castle garderobe wasn't exactly comfortable. There was no toilet paper, for one thing. So, what did people use? Here is where medieval creativity truly shines. Depending on your location and income level, you might use moss, hay, straw, handfuls of grass, or even scraps of cloth. The wealthy sometimes used wool. The poor, well, they made do with whatever nature provided. There's even a record of sailors using the communal rope, which was rinsed and reused. So, if you ever feel nostalgic for the medieval period, just remember, the past had a rope for that. Let's drift down from the castles now to the towns and cities, where things got a little messier. Urban life in the Middle Ages was noisy, cramped, and full of aroma. Every house, no matter how humble, had to deal with waste somehow. Some had private cesspits, deep holes dug beneath or behind the house. Others simply emptied chamber pots into the street. And yes, that's as bad as it sounds. The streets were not paved with charm. They were paved with mud, straw, and whatever people threw out of their windows. This is why medieval towns employed men known as gong farmers, professional cesspit cleaners. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds like one of the worst jobs in history. And you'd be right. A gong farmer's job was to climb down into cesspits, sometimes 10 feet deep, and scoop out the compacted waste with buckets. They worked mostly at night to spare the public the smell and sight. Their wages were decent, surprisingly. You could make good money doing it, but the health risks were obvious. Many died young from suffocation or infection, and yet cities couldn't function without them. So, when there were no executions, the executioner handled bodies. When there were no plagues, the gong farmer handled everything else. The great medieval division of labor. City regulations tried, with limited success, to keep things clean. In London, for example, it was illegal to throw waste out the window after dark, unless you shouted a warning. The traditional phrase was "Gardez l'eau," watch out for the water, which, predictably, is where we get the modern phrase loo, though whether anyone below actually watched out is debatable. Most people just accepted that life in the city came with occasional overhead hazards, and if you lived near a tavern or a fishmonger, the situation was even worse. Water sources, meanwhile, were under siege. Streams that once ran clear through medieval towns became dumping grounds for every imaginable substance. The same river that provided drinking water was also the local garbage disposal. People did notice. They weren't stupid. They just didn't have the infrastructure to fix it. Wells were often contaminated. Public fountains helped a bit, but even those drew from the same general supply. The concept of separating drinking water from sewage was about as distant as a toothbrush. Which brings us to another delightful invention, the public latrine. In larger cities, monasteries, and market squares, communal latrines were built. Long wooden benches with multiple holes, sometimes above a running stream. They were surprisingly social spaces. Imagine a line of people, all seated side by side, discussing the weather or local gossip while relieving themselves. Privacy was not the medieval strong suit. Monks, in particular, were very familiar with this setup. Monasteries had carefully engineered latrines with water channels running beneath them. Some of the earliest attempts at organized sanitation. They weren't glamorous, but they were practical, and in many cases, they worked. The monks, ironically, were the cleanest people in medieval Europe, if only because they had rules about washing hands before prayers. Let's drift a little farther down the social ladder now, to the peasants. For the average villager, the bathroom was nature, a patch of field, a ditch behind the house, a quiet corner near the pigs. It wasn't elegant, but it was convenient. And if you've ever wondered why medieval boots were so tall, well, now you know. Interestingly, rural people may have been cleaner than city dwellers, purely because they weren't sharing streets with thousands of chamber pots. Waste in the countryside was also recycled, in the most literal sense, used as fertilizer. That practice, known as night soil spreading, persisted for centuries. It kept fields fertile and farmers moderately employed, though it did have a tendency to ruin picnics. Now, not everything was disgusting. There were innovations. Some castles experimented with double garderobes, 2 seats side by side, for reasons of sociability that remain unclear. A few manors even had multi-story toilet towers, where each floor's waste channeled down into one large pit. So, imagine being the person who used the ground floor one. Try 2 can picture the sound. Engineers of the 13th century also designed early flushing systems using buckets of water poured manually from above, which, while rudimentary, was an improvement, though still a long way from the elegant swirl of the modern flush. Then, of course, there were the royal attempts at comfort. King Henry III of England had his garderobe lined with wood for warmth, Edward. I had one with running water beneath it, and Henry VIII, who is never one to be outdone in any department, employed a full-time servant, known as the groom of the stool. His job? To assist the king personally during his private moments? Yes, that's a real title, and it wasn't even a joke position. It was one of the most trusted roles in the royal household. Because if you were helping the king in that situation, you were obviously in on some delicate secrets. The groom of the stool handled everything. The linen, the basin, the privacy. He kept records of the king's digestive habits, which were apparently of great political interest. And before you laugh, consider this. Many grooms of the stool went on to become powerful courtiers. You could say they rose through the ranks by sitting through them first, despite all these varying arrangements, from castle towers to chamber pots. Sanitation was a constant struggle. Let's pause here for a moment. We've wandered through castles and cesspits, kings and gong farmers, all in the quiet company of medieval sanitation. In the next part, we'll drift into the smaller, stranger habits. Personal hygiene, hand-washing rituals, perfumes, and the surprisingly spiritual side of staying clean. Because in the medieval mind, washing your soul was just as important as washing your hands. So take a slow breath. Let the torchlight flicker out, and let's drift into the softer, stranger world of medieval cleanliness. What did medieval executioners do when there were no executions? The man no one wanted to talk to. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of medieval life. Not a royal banquet, not a battlefield, not even a monastery garden. No. Tonight we're wandering down a narrow, muddy street, the kind that always smells faintly of smoke and cabbage, to the edge of town, the part of town where no one really wants to live, and there, tucked behind a butcher's yard or near a tanner's shop, we'll find a little house, probably with its shutters closed. Inside lives a man with steady hands, strong arms, and a very unfortunate job title. He's the executioner. And he's not busy today, because despite what you might imagine, medieval executioners weren't constantly chopping off heads or tying people to stakes. Most of the time their schedule was fairly open, and yet they couldn't exactly take up another job at the local tavern. Not when half the town refused to look at them. So tonight, we're going to find out, what did medieval executioners do when there were no executions? Let's start with the obvious. There weren't that many executions. Even in the most brutal stretches of medieval Europe, the average town didn't have someone dying by official order every day. Executions were events, rare, theatrical, and expensive. They needed a crowd, a scaffold, a condemned criminal, and someone to do the job neatly. In between those events, weeks or months could pass, and that meant the executioner, or scharfrichter, bourreau, or carnifex, depending on your local dialect, needed to fill his time somehow. The problem was that being an executioner wasn't just a profession. It was more like a permanent state of social quarantine. You see, medieval society was very particular about pollution. Not the modern kind, the moral kind. If you worked with blood, death, or anything remotely unclean, you were technically polluted. Butchers, tanners, grave diggers all carried a faint social stain. Executioners, however, were in a category of their own. Their hands didn't just touch blood. They ended lives, and that gave them an almost supernatural kind of contamination. People believed that the touch of an executioner could bring bad luck. Their presence at a meal might make food go sour. Their handshake, if anyone dared accept one, was said to pass on the sins of those they'd killed. So, naturally, they were banned from polite society. They couldn't marry freely, couldn't go to church like everyone else, and couldn't even sit at certain taverns. Which raises the question, what do you do with your time? If no one will hire you, and your main job happens once every few months, the short answer is, you improvise. Many executioners discovered that if you were already considered unclean, you might as well make money off it. So when there were no heads to chop, they often worked as butchers. The overlap in skill set was undeniable. You had sharp knives, a steady hand, and an ability to disassociate from what was happening in front of you. In cities like Nuremberg or Augsburg, executioners ran legitimate side businesses in slaughtering livestock. They were sometimes even required to, because no one else wanted the job. The same went for disposing of animal carcasses, cleaning up after battles, or maintaining gallows and torture equipment. In other words, when there were no executions, the executioner often became the medieval equivalent of the city's waste management department. Now, in some towns, they were also the public health officials. That might sound strange, but remember, Executioners already handled corpses, and they weren't squeamish. So when plague arrived, and when doctors and priests began conveniently disappearing into the countryside, it was often the executioner who stepped forward. He collected bodies, disinfected houses, and sometimes even acted as an early form of paramedic. In Augsburg, records show an executioner named Franz Schmidt. We'll talk more about him later, who was also a respected healer. He treated wounds, pulled teeth, set bones, and performed minor surgeries. People didn't want to be seen with him in public, but in private, they were very eager to have their dislocated shoulder fixed. There's a quiet irony in that, isn't there? The man who killed for the state was also the one who cured the sick. Let's drift over to France for a moment. Here, executioners were sometimes called les hommes de justice, men of justice, which sounds noble until you realize no one wanted to live next to them. French towns often set aside a specific district for executioners and other unclean professions. In Paris, for example, the bourreau had his own residence near the Place de Grève, the city's main execution ground. His home doubled as a sort of office, armory, and trophy room. Yes, many executioners collected mementos, swords, ropes, shackles, and sometimes the clothing of the condemned. Not out of cruelty, at least not always, but because they had to keep records of each execution. Every tool was logged, maintained, and reused, and, of course, when there was nothing to execute, they sharpened their blades, practiced their aim, repaired the gallows, and waited. Now one might assume this life came with good pay. It didn't. Executioners were often promised a regular salary, but towns were notoriously bad at paying it. Some were paid by the job, which, again, wasn't great when your clients came around twice a year. To make ends meet, executioners turned to side hustles. They sold animal skins. They rented out their ropes for public hangings. Yes, really? Sometimes the same rope was reused. They sold the clothes of the condemned. Technically, a perk of the job. And in some places, they sold body parts. This is the part where you might want to dim the lights a little lower. You see, in medieval medicine, the remains of executed criminals were considered powerful ingredients. A hangman's rope was a good luck charm. The fat of an executed man was believed to cure joint pain. Blood from the scaffold was thought to help epilepsy. Executioners, being practical men, realized there was money to be made in this. Some became unofficial suppliers for local apothecaries. They'd collect what was left over after a job and sell it discreetly. To modern ears, this sounds grisly, but in the medieval mind, it was business as usual. Everything in the natural world, even human remains, could be useful if handled correctly, and, as usual, it was the executioner who knew how to handle it. So far, This might sound like a grim existence, and it was, but it was also oddly stable. Executioners were often hereditary professionals. The son of an executioner was almost always expected to continue the family trade, not because he wanted to, but because no one else would marry into the family. That created dynasties of executioners, stretching across generations. In some German towns, the same family held the role for hundreds of years. They passed down their tools, their techniques, and, unfortunately, their social isolation. These families formed small, insular communities, only marrying among themselves, or with similarly tainted professions. Over time, that made executioners a kind of subculture within medieval Europe, part of society, but always apart from it. Now, let's circle back to one of the most famous examples. Franz Schmidt, executioner of Nuremberg in the late 1500s. Schmidt kept an astonishingly detailed diary of his work, something few others did. Over his 45-year career, he executed 361 people and flogged or mutilated hundreds more. But what makes Schmidt remarkable isn't just his record-keeping. It's what he did between executions. He ran a medical practice. In his notes, he describes treating everything from ulcers to sword wounds. He charged modest fees, sometimes taking chickens or bread in payment. And despite his profession, he was actually respected for his skill. By the end of his life, he even received a rare pardon from the emperor, restoring his family's honor. So here we have a man who could, in the same week, both remove a man's head and heal another's leg. A grim multitasker of the Renaissance. Not all executioners were so fortunate. Many lived in poverty. Some turned to drink. A few became outlaws themselves. Because when society tells you you're cursed, it's hard not to live up to it eventually. But for others, there was a kind of grim pride. Executioners were, in their own way, servants of justice. They believed they kept the peace, that they carried the moral burden so others didn't have to. And when there were no executions to perform, when the crowd had gone home and the scaffold stood silent, they went back to their small, shuttered homes, sharpened their blades, and waited for the next knock on the door. Let's drift a little further now, away from Germany, and toward England. English hangmen lived slightly different lives. They didn't have the same formal training as their continental counterparts. Many were former criminals themselves, spared from the noose on condition that they become executioner instead. It was, you might say, an early form of career rehabilitation. This meant English executioners had a rougher, more improvisational reputation. Their tools weren't always well made. Their skills varied, sometimes horribly. When there were no executions, they might work as jailers, rat catchers, or general laborers. One in London was even recorded as helping to clear out plague victims in 1665. Another moonlighted as a barber. Apparently, nothing says close shave quite like a man who's professionally acquainted with rope tension. Good. Let's drift on. What did the executioner do when there were no executions? The man behind the mask. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of history. The place where justice and discomfort met, usually on a wooden platform. But don't worry, we're not here for the gore. We're here for the waiting. For all those long, empty days between executions, when the man with the axe had to figure out what to do with himself. Because for every moment when the crowd cheered and the sword came down, there were hundreds of mornings when the executioner just got up, had breakfast, and went about his life, which, as it turns out, was strange, lonely, and sometimes deeply ironic. So, settle in, dim the lights, and let's drift back to medieval Europe, to meet the men who were simultaneously necessary and untouchable. Most of us imagine the UTB, executioner, as a stock character, a hooded brute, big shoulders, a glinting blade. But the real men behind that role were bureaucrats with strong stomachs and complicated job descriptions. Their work wasn't just chopping off heads, though yes, that was part of the resume. They were city employees, and when there was no one to kill, they were still expected to earn their pay. So what did they do? Well, the short answer is everything no one else wanted to. In medieval and early modern towns, the executioner, often called the hangman or master of the sword, held one of the lowest social positions imaginable. Even though they were technically officials of the law, they were treated like contagious outcasts, not because they were dirty or criminal, but because they dealt with blood, death, and, more dangerously, guilt. People thought contact with an executioner brought bad luck. Touch his tools, his clothes, even his shadow, and you might catch some kind of moral contamination. It wasn't a good networking environment. Executioners couldn't live inside city walls in many places. They had to reside on the outskirts, in small cottages called hangman's houses. They often wore distinctive clothing, sometimes yellow or green, so people could avoid brushing against them in the market, which made it a little awkward when your job also required you to show up in public and touch people. When there were no executions, these men became, well, the town's unofficial cleaning crew. They disposed of animal carcasses, cleared dead bodies from the streets after battles or plagues, and handled all the unpleasant waste that respectable citizens preferred not to acknowledge. In some cities, they ran leper houses or managed quarantine huts during epidemics, because if anyone was already socially untouchable, it was convenient to assign them to touch the untouchables. They also maintained instruments of punishment, the stocks, the pillories, the whipping posts. If you were publicly shamed for stealing bread, the executioner might have been the one tying you to the post, and then sweeping up afterward. All of this fell under the charmingly vague phrase, municipal hygiene, which, in medieval terms, meant you do the stuff we won't. Still, the job had its perks. A salary, for one. In many towns, the executioner was paid in cash, free housing, and an allowance of beer, because, obviously, that was necessary. He was also given a horse in some places for rapid attendance to duties that, presumably, could wait a few hours while he finished his drink. And while nobody wanted to talk to the executioner, plenty of people needed him, because executioners were not just killers, they were also, and this is the strange part, healers. It sounds contradictory, but it's true. Executioners knew anatomy better than almost anyone outside a monastery. They had to. After all, if your job required striking through a neck in one blow, you learned where bones were. Many executioners also dissected bodies, assisted surgeons, or quietly practiced medicine. The most famous of these was Franz Schmidt, the official executioner of Nuremberg in the late 1500s. Schmidt kept a meticulous diary of every execution he performed, 394 in total, along with hundreds of punishments, floggings, and banishments. But when he wasn't executing people, he was running a medical practice. Patients came to him with wounds, tumors, and toothaches, and the city tolerated it, because he was good at it. By the end of his career, Schmidt was so respected as a healer that the emperor himself granted him nobility, a rare honor for someone whose job began with hanging thieves. Imagine, you spend decades killing people, and your reward is a title. That's career advancement, medieval edition. Executioners often pass their trade down through generations, because, really, who else would teach your son how to hang a man correctly? It became a family profession, grim but reliable. This also meant executioner families lived in tight social circles. They married other outcasts, knackers, grave diggers, and tanners. Children grew up knowing they would inherit not just a profession, but a stigma, and yet the job paid better than most. A skilled executioner could make the equivalent of a prosperous craftsman's income. He might own land, a decent house, even servants, though they had to be desperate enough to work for him. Still, no amount of money could buy social acceptance. At church, executioners were given separate pews. At taverns, their mugs were kept apart. If they touched a market stall, the owner might scrub it down afterward. One wonders what they did with all that free time. Probably drank or, as many records show, practiced swordsmanship, just in case business picked up again. Let's drift for a moment to the executioner's tools. The sword or axe of course, was iconic, but not always practical. In much of Europe, beheading was a luxury punishment, reserved for nobility. Ordinary criminals were hanged, drowned, burned, or broken on the wheel, and all of those required preparation. So, when there were no condemned souls awaiting their fate, the executioner was responsible for maintaining the equipment, sharpening blades, repairing ropes, oiling the wheel. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept him busy. Think of it as medieval maintenance. You can almost imagine him sitting quietly in his workshop, candlelight flickering on polished iron, while the rest of the town pretended he didn't exist. In smaller towns, the role was even broader. The executioner might double as a dog catcher, a rat killer, or a public veterinarian. Because, again, who else was going to do it? Some records show them collecting stray dogs for use in punishment rituals. Because, apparently, someone decided criminals should occasionally be symbolically mauled. The Middle Ages were nothing if not committed to weird symbolism. When the town's pig population became unruly, the executioner was called to cull them. Yes, public pig control was a government position, and yes, the hangman did it. So, when there were no executions, there were always chores, just not the kind that made good dinner conversation. The irony, of course, is that despite their isolation, executioners were often more useful than half the people in power. They dealt with the consequences of crime, disease, and disaster directly, things everyone else preferred to moralize about. And they kept the machinery of justice functioning. However brutal it was, they were, in a way, the janitors of the human condition. Necessary, invisible, and doomed to be hated for it. Let's drift now to those moments when nothing was happening. When the gallows stood empty, the sword hung on its peg, and the town had no crimes serious enough to require a performance. For some executioners, this was a relief. For others, it was financial trouble. You see, many were paid per job. No executions meant no income. So, when times were peaceful, which sounds nice in theory, they took on side work. They acted as constables, enforcing minor laws. They served as torturers, interrogating prisoners. Yes, that counted as part-time work. And they also moonlighted as medical practitioners, barbers, or animal skinners. It was a peculiar balance of livelihoods. Kill a man in the morning, set someone's dislocated shoulder in the afternoon. And yet, there were moments of dignity, because the executioner's presence reminded people that justice, however imperfect, existed. His role was ritualistic, even sacred in its own grim way. He was the final step in the social equation. Crime, trial, punishment, closure. When there was no one to execute, society still needed him there, waiting, a living symbol that authority could be enforced should the need arise. So he waited, in his little house outside the walls, sharpening blades, feeding his pigs, occasionally tending a wound or pulling a tooth, and listening to the distant noise of a world that both paid him and despised him. Hiertitwind in Antwerpen. Franz Schmidt once wrote in his diary that his duty was to do justice, not to take pleasure in it. And that's really the essence of the executioner's life, when there were no executions, doing the necessary without expecting thanks, living quietly between moments of horror, keeping busy while the rest of society pretended the world was cleaner than it really was. We'll pause here for a moment. In the next part, we'll wander a bit deeper into the personal world of these men, their families, their rituals, and the unexpected places where they found companionship, often in the least respectable corners of medieval society. Let the noise of the medieval town fade out. The distant chatter, the creak of the gallows beam, until all that's left is the steady quiet of the man who waits for justice to knock. Let's drift onward, then to what happened when executioners became doctors, detectives, and, occasionally, celebrities of punishment.